Do immigrants commit more crime? Do they take jobs from native citizens? Is an undocumented immigrant a criminal by default? These are the types of questions we'll be answering right after today's sponsor. If you're trying to stay anonymous while browsing the web or just looking to watch region-locked content,
For British eyes only.
Don't I look kind of British?
you'll probably need a VPN. Luckily, our sponsor Surfshark VPN is here to help. And unlike other companies, they actually care about their customers. Now we all know that Surfshark will keep you safe from malware, trackers, and phishing attempts. But its ability to region hop is more useful than you might realize. We've all likely come across a message like this when we've clicked on a YouTube link. But this isn't something you need to put up with. Just select from a list of over 100 other countries and enjoy what you want, when you want. In life, we're not always where we're supposed to be. Your lovable uncle was supposed to go pro before he twisted his ankle before the big game. Your strange cousin Kevin was destined to be a Viking in the year 900. And the CEO of YouTube deserves to be thrown into a volcano. Unfortunately, everyone isn't always where they belong. But with Surfshark VPN, we can all get a little closer. It's a great time to sign up to Surfshark, because by going to surfshark.com/surswag, using the code SURSWAG, or just scanning the QR code on screen, you'll be scoring yourself an extra 4 months for free. The best part is that if Surfshark doesn't meet your expectations in any way at all, you can cancel within the first 30 days and get a full refund. No questions asked. Surfshark VPN. It's cheaper than the other ones. So basically, we got sick of fact-checking shit in our regular news coverage, so this video is designed to free up space for some actual news. The conversation around immigrants within the United States tends to be filled with a lot of misunderstanding or half-truths, which is unfortunately a consequence of a pretty divided nation. So let's have a closer look into America's immigrant situation. First up, do illegal immigrants have access to welfare? A House Budget Committee estimated that the first 3 years of the Biden-Harris administration cost taxpayers $16 billion for illegal migrants using Medicaid once getting into the country. This is true, but it does need a bit of context. Generally, undocumented migrants are barred from accessing nearly all welfare programs within the United States. The major exception are migrants who are granted parole by the US Customs and Immigration Service. This is a special status reserved for people found to require urgent admission into the United States for, quote, urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit. Parolee status is granted at the discretion of the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, and often requires someone stateside to vouch for the applicant. The process for being granted parole is rather extensive, and requires that the applicant prove that there is not only some form of urgency in the granting of their parole, but also that they pass a criminal background check. You may have guessed this already, but the requirements to even apply for parole are specifically designed to filter out as many applicants as possible. Because of this, the Biden administration took it upon themselves to expand the parole system to allow for an unprecedented number of individuals to seek asylum within the United States. According to the government documents obtained by CBS in January of last year, over 1 million migrants were granted parole under the administration's policies. Many of these applicants were from countries undergoing significant political or military upheavals, such as Ukraine, Haiti, Venezuela, and Afghanistan. Jesus, how the fuck is Venezuela the best place to live on this list? For example, it's estimated that by the end of July 2024, over 520,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans were granted parole according to the US Customs and Border Protection website. It's also worth noting that parole is one of the only ways that non-resident aliens can seek immediate entry into the US. However, by definition, parolees admitted into the United States under this program are also usually considered inadmissible into the United States under typical rules. For example, if a foreign citizen needed to gain entry into the US because they had to attend the funeral of a family member, they would only be eligible for parolee status if they had no passport, were ineligible for a green card, or otherwise blocked from any other means of entering the country. This is how the misconception that parolees are illegal immigrants came about in the first place, because if they were capable of obtaining legal entry into the country through a typical port of entry, they wouldn't need to be given a parole status at all. A migrant is only considered to be in the US US illegally if they stay beyond the expiry date of their parole status. The highest estimates for how many total parolees are in the United States typically tap out at over 1 million, or roughly 8% of the estimated 11 million illegal immigrants in the country. So to bring it back to our original question of, do illegal immigrants have access to welfare? Yes, but this 8% of paroled migrants are only the ones who actually get access to it. For context, in 2024, Medicaid reported that over 71 million individuals were enrolled in the program. This means that even if every single eligible non-resident alien took full advantage of the system, this would still account for less than 1.4% of its budget. The US CIS website lists the approximate waiting period for a potential migrant to receive their parolee status, which even after the Biden administration streamlined the process, still takes around 6 months. This means an applicant must prove that there is imminent threat to themselves in their country of origin, and survive that threat for 6 months before they even hear a yes or no on their application. Additionally, social benefits are withheld from parolees for up to 5 years once they are approved, and the parole status is typically granted for only 1 year. This means an applicant would have to be granted an unusually long parole term in order to even qualify for a welfare program. It also means that exactly 0 of Biden's parolee applicants are currently eligible for any social welfare programs until at least 2028. On top of this, migrants have been found to utilize these programs significantly less than natural-born citizens in the States. According to a study published by the Cato Institute, non-citizen immigrants in the United States consumed 54% less welfare than American citizens. Additionally, federal income tax is required to be collected from all working citizens, whether they're undocumented immigrants or not. Hilariously, this means that the damn aliens pay billions of dollars into Medicaid and Social Security, with the vast majority of them being completely unable to cash out of those systems upon retiring due to their legal status. Speaking of working citizens, this leads us up to our next question. Do migrants steal jobs from native citizens? This has been a point so widely talked about that it's famously got its own subplot on South Park. Legal immigrants do have the ability to specifically enter the country in order to take jobs that they are qualified for under the H-1B work visa program. These are specifically offered to potential workers with education in specific categories, such as STEM fields and higher education degrees. These can be incredibly desirable for tech and pharmaceutical companies looking for highly educated individuals from countries like China and India. Applications for H-1B visas are also incredibly limited, with a cap of 65,000 being approved per year, along with an additional 20,000 held in reserve for applicants which hold a bachelor's or master's degree. Because of the high education requirements, H-1B visas are typically only requested by companies looking for engineers and mathematicians who show exceptional skill or specialized knowledge. Average salaries for H-1B workers range from $90,000 and $180,000 per year. By contrast, the average wage index published on the Social Security Administration's website lists the average American wage at only $66,000 as of 2023. However, this does mean that there is one field in which immigrants are stealing jobs from the US citizens, which is tech. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the largest H-1B employers in 2022 hired 34,000 visa-sponsored workers, in a year that saw those same companies lay off 85,000 employees. As just one example, Amazon was the top employer for both layoffs and H-1B hires that year, replacing 27,150 employees with nearly 6,200 H-1B workers. Other tech companies such as Google and Meta also hired record numbers of visa workers, to such an enormous degree that at least 15% of Meta's workforce is comprised of immigrant workers. They actually listed themselves as a H-1B dependent in their corporate tax filings in 2022 because of the sheer enormity of their foreign labor workforce. H-1B visas are something of a diverse topic within the generally anti-immigrant Republican Party. In one corner, you have the Elon Musk tech wing, which argues that H-1B visas allow America to poach talent from other countries in order to stay competitive. On the other end of the party, you have the former Trump White House chief strategist Steve Bannon. He argues that the H-1B visa program is just an excuse to replace American jobs with cheaper foreign workers, who are reliant on their positions to remain in the country. But let's look at the other end of the spectrum at low-skilled jobs. Alexander Arnon, the director of business tax and economic analysis at Penn Wharton Budget Model, Jesus Christ, really needs a better name. Anyway, according to this economist nerd, quote, "Overall, the consensus is very strong that there are not significant costs to US-born workers from immigration. Research does, however, indicate that native US citizens without a high school degree are the most likely to suffer a more competitive jobs market, as they largely share the same level of qualifications as a large share of immigrants. Michael Clemens, a professor at George Mason University, does however contend that both low-skilled migrants and native citizens tend to complement each other, even if they have similar skill sets. After all, the jobs market isn't static, because although migrants occupy jobs, their spending habits also create jobs within the local economy. A 2020 study also found that migrants are 80% more likely to become entrepreneurs than native workers, which is why Apu from The Simpsons is canonically accurate. Research by Perry and Alessandro Caimi of the University of California also found that occupational upgrading generally leads to lower-skilled native workers who compete with lower-skilled migrants to earn higher wages in the future. It was found that between 2000 to 2019, such occupational upgrading accounted for 1.7 to 2.6% wage increase for less educated native workers. It's actually so cold that academics hit us with the skill issue. There is, however, evidence to suggest that enormous waves of immigrants can indeed have short-term effects within the low-skilled job market. One such paper was published by Harvard economist George Boyas, who studied the effect of Mariel Boatlift, a mass immigration of 125,000 Cuban refugees into South Florida in 1980. Boyas found that this flooding of the low-skilled job market reduced the wages of native high school dropouts by anywhere between 10 to 30%. It should be mentioned that Boyas's research into the effects of Mariel Boatlift have been disputed by other academics. But even if we can assume his findings are solid, introducing 125,000 workers into one state's job market over a period of just 6 months is a pretty extreme example. So are immigrants stealing jobs from native workers? Ultimately, it depends on where you are and what you do. For the majority of US citizens, this will never be a concern. But for those in high-skilled tech jobs, getting replaced with someone from overseas becomes much more likely. High school dropouts are most likely to share the same job market with migrant workers. However, there's limited evidence that this affects job availability. There is evidence to suggest that migrant workers can put downwards pressure on wages. However, this effect tends to be localized to specific regions and industries. Our third question is, what is the actual cost of illegal aliens entering the United States? Trying to pin down a solid answer for this one was pretty much impossible, and the answers tended to vary wildly depending on who was conducting the research. Non-profit organization, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, estimated that the cost of illegal aliens on the American taxpayer measured roughly $150 billion in 2024. This was done by subtracting $31 billion in tax revenue by these migrants from the $182 billion in expenses for keeping them around. However, this is when we start getting into disagreements on how much tax revenue is earned and what counts as an expense. A competing study from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy found that undocumented immigrants contributed nearly $100 billion in tax revenue in 2022, which they argued would rise to an extra $40 billion if these workers had official access to work authorization. We also have to consider whether we're looking at undocumented migrants for a long-term or short-term perspective, as second or third generation migrants tend to be much higher contributors of tax revenue when compared to their parents and grandparents. This is particularly important for this comparison because of the $182 billion in expenses mentioned by the Federation for American Immigration Reform, $70 billion of that is in public schooling for the children of undocumented migrants. So when we remember that these children generally go on to be net tax contributors over their lifetimes, it's less of a question of how much undocumented immigrants cost, but more of a calculation of how long it takes before they, as an investment, starts paying off. That's before we consider that migrants have different costs depending on the level of government, with the local levels tending to feel a higher net cost in the early years of a migrant's stay. It's also worth mentioning that the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy is an unapologetic left-wing think tank, while the Federation for American Immigration Reform was founded by a white nationalist in 1979. You really need to pick your poison on that one. Overall, undocumented migrants do tend to cost the taxpayer in the short term, but they usually become an economic net positive the longer they remain in the country. Our next question is, do illegal immigrants commit more crime than native citizens? According to a study by the Cato Institute in 2017, which measured crime rates in Texas, migrants tended to commit less crime across every single category which was measured. Legal migrants, however, tended to commit less crime than illegal migrants. However, both were less likely than native Texans lessons to get on the wrong side of Johnny Law. Going further, according to a study published by the National Institute of Health in 2018, undocumented immigration has actually brought a measurable decline in crime rates in the communities they tend to gravitate towards. In fact, they measured a 12% decrease in violent crime in communities which saw a 1-unit increase in undocumented immigrants into their population. Much of this was attributed to the demographics who tend to illegally enter the United States in the first place. With many of such migrants being families trying to escape crime, this tends to make them inherently adverse to breaking the law themselves. This does lead us into our next question. If migrants are less likely to commit crime within the United States, why do so many enter the country illegally? The unfortunate reality is that for the vast majority of individuals trying to immigrate to the United States, gaining entry is famously difficult. You could even say it's borderline impossible. Immigration into the United States is typically handled via what's known as a green card, which can be obtained a number of different ways. However, many of the requirements are either based on work eligibility or a raffle system. For example, almost all green cards bear the requirement that somebody within the US is advocating for your admission into the country. This is typically an employer, but can also include family members under specific circumstances. As you've probably already guessed, the average person attempting to cross the border illegally usually doesn't have anyone to advocate on their behalf. America's green card raffle system is another option, but that's capped out at 50,000 entrants yearly. Considering the raffle is contested by 22 million applicants every year, that's an admission rate of just 0.2%. Not exactly a viable option for those looking to enter the country legally. Additionally, only citizens from areas that are not considered high-volume immigration countries are permitted to apply for the yearly diversity raffle. However, even potential migrants who have people who can vouch for them within the United States can face astronomical waiting lists to even have their case reviewed. For example, a married Mexican citizen who is the son or daughter of a US citizen will have an estimated visa processing time of 24 years. Faced with these limited options, it's not surprising that individuals seeking urgent entry into the country simply don't consider legal entry a viable course of action. It's also worth mentioning that many of these criminals are not actually considered criminals by law, but rather undocumented immigrants. While this differentiation may seem like pedantic hair-splitting, there is a meaningful difference. Entering the United States without proper authorization is a civil offense against the country, which can result in deportation and the possibility of fines. However, re-entering the country after being deported is a legal offense, and if caught, often results in jail time and more severe penalties. Calling an undocumented immigrant a criminal doesn't really do justice to how societies tend to treat other civil offenses. Getting a parking ticket is considered a civil offense, but we don't brand anyone a criminal for staying 40 minutes in a 20-minute zone. I mean, you can, but you don't. Our last question today is a bit harder to answer. Do immigrants erode a nation's culture and values? Those in support of stricter immigration policies will often argue that if too many foreigners move into a country, it will cause its shared culture to change. This is actually true. And as new people move into an area, culture does tend to evolve from their influence. Whether these cultural shifts are better or worse is an eye of the beholder situation, and countries tend to have different policies in terms of how they might expect migrants to assimilate. A Stanford study would find that assimilation, for better or worse, is mostly just a question of time. Explaining it better than we could, quote, "It would be a mistake to determine our nation's immigration policy based on the belief that immigrants will remain foreigners, preserving their old ways of life and keeping themselves at arm's length from the dominant culture. The evidence is clear that assimilation is real and measurable, that over time immigrant populations come to resemble natives, and that new generations form distinct identities as Americans. This isn't to say that a nation is immune from the culture from migrant communities. However, it isn't necessarily a bad thing. For example, the United States has very clearly embraced Mexican cuisine, and Australia owes its zealous coffee culture to its Mediterranean migrant community. This isn't to say that migrants don't come with their own host of issues. Viewers might be aware of Sweden's rising gang violence, which has seen a spike in migrant-heavy suburbs in recent years, or Germany's Syrian refugee crisis, which saw over 1 million asylum seekers enter the country, causing cultural tensions. Cultural differences certainly exacerbate the difficulties of assimilation. assimilation, which include the gender roles of women, language barriers, as well as workplace norms and expectations. However, cultural barriers tend to play much less of a role than structural and institutional barriers, which can limit how quickly migrants are able to integrate into society. For the gang situation we mentioned in Sweden, for example, researchers generally agree that the problem is socioeconomic and not cultural. It should probably be obvious by now, but a pretty big determiner of how well migrants assimilate into a society is how much the host country can assist them in doing so. You may have noticed that in the last few examples where migrants have negatively affected citizens in the host country, the systems in place to help these people were overwhelmed with an influx of refugees. Immigrants generally have a positive long-term effect on the country they move to, but for many, these benefits are tied to how willing and able the host country is to help and accept them. This entire video was something of a trial run for a larger fact-checking series. A setup where you guys can ask us questions like, are electric cars really better for the environment? Is anyone actually working on Titanfall 3? And does the CIA really pay all the big titty goth girls to stay away from me? We really don't give a shit. We'd like to thank everyone for watching, and until next time, have a fucking good one.